All right, thanks. Thanks for that intro. So yeah, this is the analysis that I'm going to focus on is a collaboration with two doctoral students, Gerard Torres Espinosa and Delorme Takyar. But it is the basis for a chapter in the book that kind of asks the question of why violence fell. So that's primarily the question that I'll address today, but I do want to give some context for that question and kind of just give a little bit of the stuff that I'm focusing on in the rest of the book. So these are the four main issues I'll touch on. The first one, you've seen this graph, I'm sure, before. This is a homicide rate. This is from 1960 through 2015. And so we had this run up in the 60s where the homicide rate doubled and then stayed at a very high level through the early 1990s. Then we had this sharp decline in the 1990s and in the 2000s, and then a further decline, and just in 2015 it bumped up again. It bumped up again in 2016 above 5.1. So the analysis here that I'll present goes to 2014. Okay. Now 2014 it's an important year historically. So basically, the homicide rate was 4.5 per 100,000 in 2014. So it was the safest year, at least by the homicide rate, in the last 50 years. And if we, from what we know from historical data, which is not great, but based on what we know, it looks like this was one of the safest years in the history of the country. So that's kind of the context. Now the greatest changes occurred in American cities. So this is a map of U.S. cities. This is 180 of the largest cities. All of these cities had 100,000 people in 1990. And they're shaded by the homicide rate. So the darker shaded cities are the ones that had homicide rate at least 20 per 100,000. And then the darkest shades were cities that had homicide rates of at least 40 or more. So these are like equivalent to the most violent nations in the world. Okay, so this is 1993. This is the same map in 2014. Okay, there's still violence. We see pockets of cities in Michigan, down in Louisiana and the Northeast that are still extremely violent. So violence hasn't gone away, of course. And actually, if I reproduce this map for 2016, there'd be some more cities that look darker than this. But I want to point out this contrast. Okay, 1993, 2014. In 1993, I think, or in the 1980s and 1990s, cities really became associated with violence. Violence came to be seen as the central feature of urban life. And what I argue in the book is that there's been this fundamental change. That's no longer true. Okay, so cities violence is no longer a dominant feature of city life in most of the country. The number of cities that are still extremely violent, have homicide rates above 20, is about 10 to 20%. It used to be about half. Okay. Okay, so the case that I make in the book is that this has really changed the nature of urban inequality and the experience of urban poverty. I'll make this case empirically very quickly here. So this graph shows, this is 6 cities. Okay, these 6 cities are not representative of anything. These are the 6 cities for which we could get neighborhood level data on violent crime going back at least a decade or longer. Okay. So this gives a sense. It's not a perfect sense, but it gives us a sense of what neighborhood conditions look like in these 6 cities before crime started to fall and then after crime started to fall. Okay, so this particular graph is showing, this is like, I know many people here study segregation, so this is like an exposure index. Okay, this is showing us the violent crime rate in the neighborhood of the average poor resident. These are the darker columns. Okay. And in the neighborhood of the average non-poor resident in each city. And this is before the crime drop. Okay, so you see overall extremely high rates of exposure to neighborhood violence, and this huge gap between poor and non-poor residents. Okay, so now we fast forward, and the time frames are a little bit different for the 6 cities, but think of this as before the crime drop, and then this is after the crime drop. Okay, so there's still inequality and exposure to violence, but you can just see this marked difference in the everyday experience of urban poverty. Okay, so victimization rates for the poorest Americans now I'm sorry, for the richest Americans now are, I keep getting this wrong. Victimization rates for the poorest Americans now are equivalent to what victimization rates for the richest Americans were back in the 1990s. Okay, and that's true for the nation as a whole. So that's also true in these 6 cities, but that's true for the nation as a whole. Okay. So what I argue in the book is that this has really changed the nature of the experience of urban poverty. I think these changes are sufficient to push us to really rethink what urban poverty actually means today versus what it meant back in 1993. And the classics, you know, if you're taking a course on urban poverty, you're reading American Apartheid, you're reading The Truly Disadvantaged, Code of the Street. These are the classics of urban poverty. Well, these classics were written at a time when cities across the country were extremely violent places, okay? And that's still true in a lot of places. You could still write similar books, and people are writing similar books about cities where violence is still a central feature of daily life. It's true in Baltimore still, it's true in Chicago again. But it doesn't capture the experience of urban America now as it did 20 years ago. Okay, so I make this case in the book, and I look at how the decline in violence has affected outcomes like economic mobility, economic segregation, life expectancy, how kids are performing in school. That's kind of the argument of the book. It raises this second question of why did violence fall? And when I started working on the book, I consciously did not want to address this question because there's been so much written on it. It's really difficult to make progress on this question empirically. And so that worked until I started talking to anyone about what I was doing. And the first question, when you say you're writing a book on the consequences of a crime drop, the first question from every single person is, well, why did violence fall? So I realized very quickly that I had to write this chapter, and I had to produce something on this question, or at least have an answer to this question. Now, this is a recent article on Vox.com that kind of, and there are many articles like this that kind of review the most prominent theories about why crime fell. And this one is pretty comprehensive. So you'll notice, if you can read it, it's a little small, but if all the kind of popular explanations and the academic explanations, pretty much everything's there, from changes in abortion law at the bottom, lead exposure at the bottom, medication for ADHD and depression, and then police tactics, broken windows policing, increased incarceration. It's all there, okay? And this is a national debate on why violence fell. I mean, this is about as extensive as it goes, okay? What I noticed when I really got into this literature is that it was missing something. It was missing when I presented my first book, I talked to a lot of community groups. This list misses what they told me about why violence fell in their neighborhoods. This list misses kind of the anecdotal case that community organizations tell about why violence fell. So the story that is told on the ground by people working on the ground about why violence fell is that people came together and they fought to control violence. They fought to retake public parks. They came together and they decided that this was no longer tolerable. They were going to retake their block. They were going to look out after the kids on their neighborhood, and they were going to end the intense violence that had persisted throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Okay, and these stories about neighborhoods that have turned around, this is like, there are a large number of books that make this case. This is one of the better ones, house by house, block by block. But there are other ones. Robert Putnam has done some good work just documenting local organizations that where people came together to try to retake their neighborhoods. There's tons of these organizations that make these, remarkable, extravagant claims. Now the purpose-built communities, I think, is the best one out there. Okay, but they didn't reduce violence by 97%. So this is a kind of an industry of books, mainly written by activist journalists who are arguing that community organizations, that people in the communities hit hardest by violence were the ones responsible for turning their neighborhoods around. And it's easy to dismiss this literature. It has been dismissed. Okay, this hasn't made it into national debates about why crime fell. And it's feel-good stories. They're not particularly focused on rigorous evidence for the most part. Okay, so it's easy to dismiss this entire set of claims. As I started working on this chapter, I kind of thought maybe we shouldn't dismiss it. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why I started to think that. The first one is that when I finally decided, okay, I have to write a chapter on why violence fell, I asked 3 of our best students, Gerard, Delaram Takyar, and then Kiara Dowds also worked on this with me. And we basically sat down and said, what data sources can we use to understand what was going on in cities during the 1990s? And we spent a full summer gathering every data source that we could find, looking at not just police force size and incarceration, but things like public libraries, local establishments. There were many. I'm blanking on what else we looked at, but basically everything that we could find about city life, we tried to see if we could get national data, just to take a descriptive look and to see what was going on in the cities where violence fell the most. And one of the data sets that we obtained was a national data set on nonprofits that the Urban Institute collected. And this is one of the first graphs we looked at, where we specifically isolated anti-violence nonprofits and just looked at what the trend has been. We also looked at this within cities. But this is the national trend for anti-violence nonprofits. And these are all in rates, but this is showing not the cumulative number, but the growth, yearly growth in anti-violence nonprofits. And we see in 1990, this is when they started to rise very quickly. Turns out that this is a common story. All kinds of local community organizations were basically starved in the Reagan administration when Reagan was trying to turn the nonprofit sector back into a purely charitable sector, okay? And then in the 1990s, they came back. So this was a large-scale mobilization that I, for one, wasn't aware of. But when we started to look at the national data, what we saw was that this was true across the board. All kinds of community-based organizations exploded in the 1990s and proliferated in cities across the country. Okay, so that was one hint. Second hint is that if we look at a long-standing tradition of urban and criminological social theory, there's a huge strand of this literature focuses on how violence is regulated through informal sources of social control, again, that are internal to communities, okay? So the basic claims, this is what's usually known as the systemic model of community life, okay? Social cohesion, informal control are driven by interactions between residents, organizations, and institutions within communities that collectively affect their likelihood of achieving common goals within the community. And this is Robert Sampson's work on collective efficacy, Bursick and Gramscick's work on how violence is regulated by institutions and actors within communities. Okay, this work has been extremely influential in the study of cross-neighborhood variation in crime, okay? But it has never been used to try to understand trends in crime, to try to understand why violence rises and falls. Okay, so this is like a huge part of the literature of criminology and urban sociology that has just not been incorporated into discussions of the crime drop. And that's primarily a data issue, but no one has made the theoretical connection that I know of, at least as well. So organizations in this role, and I should be clear that I'm not testing this whole theory. I'm not looking at any measures of collective efficacy or the role of perceptions and trust within communities. Purely taking this one piece, organizations, and trying to incorporate it into the national debates about the crime drop. Okay, so organizations within this theory play several roles. They facilitate ties between residents, link together public and private institutions, play a role in enhancing social cohesion and trust. And then the last one is important. they also play a direct role in, or at least their mission, a lot of their mission is to play a direct role in engaging young people and confronting violence. Okay, and then lastly, the last reason I think we should look at organizations is because there's more and more rigorous evidence suggesting that some organizations are extremely effective. And so just in the past few years, there have been a bunch of randomized trials, several of which were run by the Crime Lab in Chicago, showing that cognitive behavioral therapy combined with after-school programs reduce arrests among adolescents in Chicago by 45 to 50%. Assignment to summer jobs, this is also in Chicago, has been combined with cognitive behavioral therapy, had this enormous effect on arrests due to violence, again in Chicago. There's a growing literature on business improvement districts, okay? And Gerard, actually, Gerard Torres Espinosa, one of the students on this paper, has a separate paper that goes further than the existing literature on BIDs, really makes a very strong causal case about their impact on crime. And then there's recent work from Philadelphia on what happens when abandoned lots are redesigned and rebuilt and how that affects violence as well. So again, it's the anecdotal case, it's the theoretical case, and now a growing empirical base to tell us that some of these organizations are actually extremely effective in reducing violence. Okay, so here's the challenge. How do we identify the effect of local community organizations on violence? There are two major parts of this challenge. The first is data. So I think this is the primary reason why people have not studied the systemic model at the national level, why they have not used it to explain trends in violence over time. We don't have national data on most components of the systemic model of community life. We certainly don't have it over a long period of time. So that's why I'm only focusing on local organizations and not the other components of the systemic model. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use data on the full population of city nonprofits from 1990 to 2013. This is a file that the Urban Institute put together from IRS data. Okay. And then second, the methodological problem is how to deal with the endogenated nonprofit formation. Okay, so nonprofits form for a lot of reasons, but one major reason is to respond to a problem like crime and violence. Okay, so that means if you look at the association between the number of anti-violence nonprofits in a city and the level of crime, it will be positive. And in fact, it is positive in our data. And it's not because they cause crime, it's because they are endogenous to the problem of crime. Okay, so we use three approaches. In the most basic approach, we just looked at change over time in the number of nonprofits and linked that with change in crime, okay, with controls for what else was going on within the city. Secondly, the one that I think is a little bit more persuasive is we analyze short-term, year-to-year changes in nonprofit formation, lagged 1 year, and then we looked at changes in crime in the following year. Okay, gives us basically the same answer as the first analysis. And then we want to use a different approach, and here we are going to exploit variation in community and crime-oriented nonprofits that is driven by something other than crime. Okay, so in this case, we're going to use an instrument that we'll argue it allows us to exploit variation driven by overall funding availability for nonprofits as opposed to the problem of crime. And I'll explain this in more depth in a second, right here. Okay, so specifically we're going to use change in nonprofits focusing on things that have nothing to do with crime. Focusing on the arts and humanities, environmental protection, and medical research. We're going to use these changes, year-to-year changes and long-term changes, to instrument for changes in nonprofits that specifically focus on things that we think do affect crime, okay? Like anti-violence programs, substance abuse programs, recidivism programs. This is the basic approach, okay? The assumptions that we have to satisfy for this approach to work is first, the instrument has to be strongly related to the treatment. In this case, it's extremely strongly related. So trends in nonprofits at the city level move together very closely. I think I have a slide showing that. So this is at the national level, but this is also true at the city level. For every 10 nonprofits focusing on arts, medical research, and the environment, there are 6 nonprofits formed focusing on crime and community life. Okay. We have to assume that the instrument has no direct impact on crime. Okay, and we can we took some steps to try to at least be more cautious than just lumping in all nonprofits. So our first step was basically look at all nonprofits in these categories, and then we specifically went through and tried to exclude nonprofits that we thought might have some connection to crime and check if the results change, and they don't. So that's our second strong assumption. And then we have to assume that basically these set of nonprofits in our instrument are unrelated to prior trends in crime, or more generally, that they're unrelated to potential outcomes at the city level. Okay, that they're basically randomly assigned. Trends are basically randomly assigned, conditional on what we have in our model. Okay, so this makes sense. These are kind of the core assumptions for the IV strategy. And I don't want to reify the idea that the IV strategy is the magic bullet here. It's really not. What I want you to do is kind of look at all of the results together and notice the fact that they all tell the identical story with slight differences in magnitude. And the second set of models, I think, the short-term change models, may actually be more persuasive than the IV models. Okay. Any questions on the setup, the approach? Yes?
So something drives changes in nonprofits.
Yeah.
And my gut reaction is maybe that's like economic conditions in the city drive like the prevalence of arts and humanities nonprofits, and might also have a direct effect on crime prevalence.
Yeah.
So like an exogeneity.
Could be, yeah. So we checked whether, sorry, I'm going deep into the slides here. We checked whether, I may not have it. Oh, that was a big waste. No, I don't have it. Sorry. So we looked at, we predicted the instrument based on economic conditions, and there's no relationship based on prior lagged economic conditions. So we did do, it's definitely a concern, and we did do some, to the extent that we can, we looked at it, and there wasn't a strong relationship. That said, your first point, nonprofits are driven by something, is one that we don't have a great answer for, right? Like it's a mix of voluntarism, it's a mix of state funding, which is a huge source of why nonprofits emerge, and philanthropic activity. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So relatedly, I'm wondering where the funding availability for nonprofits comes from. You said it's at the state level.
No, it's federal and state.
Federal and state,
Yeah.
not local. Okay.
Yeah. Other questions about this piece?
Is community city?
City, yeah.
City, they're the same thing?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so we could go down lower, but we can't measure crime at a lower level. That's the problem. Okay, so the data come from this file that the Urban Institute put together. I won't go into any detail except to say that we used the classification scheme that was already put together, focusing on these categories of nonprofits. And then we also massage this a little bit by using keywords that are related to crime and violence, okay? So this classification scheme we found is nowhere near perfect. In fact, they had grades for how well the organization matches with its category. So we also, we were missing a lot of crime-related organizations. So we had keywords like violence and crime, violence, delinquency, gang. We used the kind of a keyword search to include an additional set of organizations in this. Okay, to give a sense of what kind of organizations are in both the treatment measure of crime, what I'm calling crime community nonprofits. I might, in the paper, we end up just calling it community nonprofits because it was so awkward to keep writing crime/community. So I might revert to that language here, even though one could question whether these are all community organizations. They're all organizations that in some way focus on victims of crime, violence itself, or the types of activities typically associated with crime, okay? And then there are an additional set that focus on building stronger neighborhoods, okay? So groups like Fourth Ward Neighbors Incorporated, these are community groups designed to support neighbors in need. They're not specifically focused on violence. They're also in our models, okay? Okay, we look at crime from FBI Uniform Crime Reports data from 1991 to 2014. This is, so we look at three different kinds of crime: murder, violent crime, and property crimes, with a set of controls for basic demographic information at the city level, economic conditions at the city level, okay? And we're looking at the largest 300 cities, but our I shouldn't say it. Our working sample is 264 cities with complete data, okay? All right, so the first model that we'll look at is just, and I'll go through these a little quickly. I realize that we have a sharp end point at 1. This is just a basic change model, looking at change in crime as a function of change in nonprofits with controls, okay? The second model, we use the IV approach with this long-term change model where we're instrumenting for the change in community-oriented nonprofits with the measure of medical, environmental, and arts nonprofits, okay? The third model that I'll show you is a year-to-year city fixed effects model, which exploits change in nonprofits from one year to the next, predicted by change in community nonprofits from lagged 1 year, okay, with the same controls lagged 1 year. And then we run this with the instrument for the year-to-year change in community nonprofits. Okay, so there are basically two tables that show all of the results. The first 3 columns, these are the OLS results. So these are the long-term change models. This is telling us that the metric that I think makes the most sense is to think about 10 additional nonprofit organizations in a city of 100,000 people, okay? And so this, when you translate, the outcomes are logged. So when you translate these coefficients, this tells us that for each 10 additional community organizations, there's a 6% decline in the murder rate, okay? 6% decline in the violent crime rate and a 5% decline in the property rate, okay? For the two-stage least squares estimates, this is the first stage. So this is telling us how well 23-year changes in arts, medical, environmental nonprofits predict changes in community nonprofits, and this tells us that for every 10 new arts, medical, environmental nonprofits, there are 6 new community nonprofits, okay? So this F-stat is off the charts, it's over 100. So this is a very strong predictor of change in community nonprofits. When we use the IV, our estimates tell us that every 10 new community nonprofits leads to a 12% reduction in murder, 10% reduction in violent crime rate, and 7% reduction in the property crime rate. Okay? Oh, and so putting that into standard deviation terms, I think the average was, or the standard deviation of change from 1990 to 2013 was 24 community nonprofits per 100,000. Okay? So I'm talking about all the coefficients in terms of an addition of 10 organizations, basically multiply it by 2.4 to get the standard deviation, the impact of one standard deviation change. Okay? Okay, questions on the first? These are the models of the long-term change?
I'm a little confused about how you model long-term change, because so, like, what you showed us in terms of the exogeneity assumption of the instrument was based on sort of shorter-term trends,
Yeah.
right? So I would assume just urban rebirth, gentrificate, all those things are driving simultaneously, to Ian's question, driving
Long-term
overall-
change in
I believe the
nonprofits.
exogenous assumption under a short
Yeah.
time frame, but on a 20-plus year time frame,
Yeah.
I don't see.
I kind of agree with you. I mean, we definitely prefer the short-term models and report the short-term
You
models.
always got to that.
Yeah, and so we'll get there. But I think the reason we ended up putting in the long-term models is because it makes it more relevant for the story about the crime drop, right? Like, because the answer is so similar with the long-term and the short-term models, I kind of like being able to tell, well, this many new nonprofits formed in these cities. So this, if we trust these estimates, given how similar they are to the short-term models, then these are the implications for how much the growth in the nonprofit sector may have contributed to the crime drop. But I do think the assumptions are more plausible in the short-term models. So that's what these results show. And in the OLS results, you can see them here. So every 10 new community nonprofits leads to a 5% reduction in murder, 4% reduction in violent crime and property crime rates. And then when we have a similarly strong first stage. When we go to the IV estimates, every 10 new community-oriented nonprofits leads to a 9% reduction in murder, 6% reduction in violent crime rates, 4% reduction in the property crime rates. And so from these estimates, a 1 standard deviation change in community nonprofits leads to a 22% drop in murder, 14% drop in violent crime, and 10% drop in property crime. So this is not explaining the whole crime decline, okay? Violence dropped homicide rates dropped by at least 75% in a good number of cities, okay? It was not uncommon for cities, Los Angeles, Fort Worth, New York, San Diego. These cities completely transformed. Violence dropped by 75 to 80%, okay? So this is not explaining what happened. This is not the sole answer for the decline of violence. But I do think, A, I've become confident that these results are plausible, and B, I think this is an important piece of the puzzle that we've overlooked so far. Okay, so we ran this a bunch of different ways, and there's some variation in the findings, but our core results are not sensitive to how we did this. So these are all the short-term year-to-year models, and I just want to show that it's basically the same estimate if we include the largest cities or exclude all the largest cities. If we include measures, the reason we didn't include incarceration rates and the size of police forces in the main models is because we have a lot of missing data, so we ended up having to exclude a bunch of years if we did that. But when we throw them back in there, the estimates don't change. Okay, estimates vary a little bit more with violent crime than they do for homicide, but we have very stable results no matter how we run the models and no matter the particular decisions we made. We did a few more robustness checks, but the one I'll show you is to basically really try to narrow in on the timing of when nonprofits formed and do a little bit of a placebo to see if nonprofits formed after we measure if crime had any effect on crime. If they did, then we're in trouble. So you can see this kind of nice temporal pattern. These are estimated with a lot more imprecision because we only use newly added nonprofits for these models to get the timing exactly right. But it did reinforce the main findings. Nonprofits measured after crime happened. So there wasn't something unobserved that was latent and sitting in that city and ready to happen that was driving all of these results. We can at least kind of be a little bit more confident about the timing. Okay, so this is basically a summary of the what I just said, all of the results. I think these are the estimates we kind of hang our hat on. One standard deviation change in community and crime nonprofits led to a 22% drop in the murder rate, 14% drop in violent crime, and 10% drop in property crime. Okay, so the last question is, what does this mean? First, for understanding why violence fell, for kind of rethinking the literature on the crime drop, and then secondly, what does it mean moving forward? And I think on that first question, you know, there's this huge literature that has focused on theories of the crime drop, and most of the attention has been given to the most counterintuitive theories. Okay, theories that kind of, and some of them are plausible and some of them are less plausible, but there's just been enormous attention of researchers trying to find some exogenous, unrelated change in society that affected crime, whether it be changes in abortion law 20 years earlier, changes in medication for ADHD, changes in air conditioning, you know, video game, use of social media or video game. And all of these, I don't dismiss any of them. And like for some, like lead, you know, I think lead has a causal effect on crime. I think we can be pretty confident of that. Abortion laws probably does have a causal effect on crime. But as I've done more and more of this work, I've kind of come to think that it's not particularly likely that some change that was completely unrelated to crime and violence was the real cause of the crime drop. I've come to think that it's much more likely that in the 1990s, there was a large-scale mobilization against violence that occurred, and that all of these changes that took place during that time, collectively, and some were positive, some were negative, but collectively, these can really be considered a better explanation for why crime fell. So in my book, I call this the endogenous theory of the crime drop. It's basically arguing that crime came to be seen as a national crisis at a particular point in time. And this graph shows that, I think, very well. So this is from the Gallup poll, asking people the most important problem facing the nation. This has been asked since the 1930s. For the first time in the history of this poll, in 1994, crime was the number one response. Okay, so more than half of respondents said crime and violence were the most important problems facing the country in 1994. And this is not an anomalous figure. In the early 1990s, the country became obsessed with violence. Okay, it was a Republican issue before that. It became a Democratic issue in the 1990s. The politicians from every political party were trying to appear tougher on crime. This is a time when the harshest sentencing laws were passed. This is a time when police forces were bolstered through federal funding, and tens of thousands of new police officers were distributed across the most violent cities. It's also a time when the private, so that another outcome, data point that we looked at was private security forces. Private security forces exploded in the 1990s. Okay, homeowners installed alarm systems to an astonishing degree in the 1990s. Technology appeared like LoJack that made it extremely difficult to steal cars in the late 80s, 1990s. Schools started to install metal detectors and camera systems. Cities started monitoring key public spaces across the city with surveillance systems in the 1990s. So, you know, what I argue is that there was this large-scale mobilization to deal with violence, and it happened at one point in time. And it's much more plausible to me to think that all of these actions, this collective mobilization, was responsible for why crime fell. Okay? The problem, or the contribution, I hope, from this paper is that the mobilization that happened internal to communities was left out of the story. Okay, so it wasn't just that police departments expanded. It wasn't just that camera systems were installed. There was more than surveillance. Community organizations exploded. Okay, residents and community leaders started to mobilize on a large scale. And again, there are all these anecdotal accounts of this, but this hasn't been brought into discussions of why crime fell. Okay, so when it's not brought into those discussions, then crime and violence are depicted, they're kind of conceptualized as outcomes that are entirely dependent on forces external to the communities where violence hits hardest. Does that make sense? So the problem of crime comes to be seen as a problem that can only be addressed by solution outside of the places where it occurs. Okay? And I think that conceptualization, that depiction, that explanation of why crime rises and falls translates directly into policy. It translates into a model of dealing with violence that relies heavily on the police and the prison, okay? And that does not look to community organizations as potential solutions to the crime drop. So this is where, and I focus much more on the policy story in the book, obviously. But if we think about the current situation right now, I kind of make the case that our model of dealing with urban poverty and violence dates back to the late 1960s, where we settled on a model that relies on abandonment of urban communities and punishment of their residents, okay? And that model hasn't been entirely consistent over time, but that's basically those have been the two major tenets of how we deal with urban poverty and urban inequality since the 1960s. Well, that model is breaking down, and it has broken down over the past few years when two of the major components of that model are reliance on the prison system and on the police to deal with violence and all the challenges that come with urban poverty are starting to be called into question. Okay, they've been called into question for a long time by some segments of communities, but now nationally they're starting to be called into question, and the role, particularly of the police, is starting to change. Okay, so then the question arises, well, what's the next model? Who can play a larger role to oversee urban neighborhoods? And my hope is that this analysis contributes to that. My hope is that this analysis kind of allows people to see that community organizations may have the greatest capacity to play a larger role in confronting violence. And theory has told us for a while, but the evidence hasn't been great. So that's what I hope the contribution of this paper is. All right, I've got 15 minutes for questions, I think.